Let me start by saying this. I'm not the kind of person who enjoys conflict. In fact, I try to avoid it whenever I can. I like to think of myself as friendly and easygoing, someone who values peace over drama. So when Karen moved in next door 6 months ago, I did what any good neighbor would do. I baked her a plate of cookies, knocked on her door with a warm smile, and welcomed her to the neighborhood. She seemed nice at first glance, polite, though maybe a little distant. But then, things took a turn. It all started one morning when I was getting ready for work. I walked out of my house, coffee mug in hand, only to stop dead in my tracks. There it was, Karen's shiny silver SUV, parked right smack in the middle of my driveway. At first, I thought it might be some sort of mix-up. Maybe she had guests staying over or an emergency that forced her to use my space temporarily. After all, everyone makes mistakes, right? So I decided to approach the situation calmly. I crossed the small patch of grass separating our houses and knocked on her front door. When Karen answered, I pointed toward the driveway and said, "Hey, I noticed your car is in my driveway. Is everything okay?" She barely blinked before responding. "Oh, sorry about that," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Our garage is full, so I figured I'd just park there for now. Your driveway looked empty anyway." Empty? Sure. But available? Not even close. I tried to keep my tone light but firm. "I understand, but it's private property. Could you please move it soon?" "Of course," she replied quickly, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll take care of it later today." Later that day came and went, but her car stayed put. Days turned into weeks, and every time I asked her about it, she gave me the same vague promises. "I'll move it tomorrow," she'd say, or "I'm just waiting for my husband to get home." Yet nothing changed. Her SUV remained stubbornly parked where it didn't belong. At first, I told myself to let it slide. Maybe she was going through something stressful, a busy schedule, family issues, or whatever else. Everyone deserves the benefit of the doubt, right? But as the days dragged on, my patience wore thinner and thinner. It wasn't just about the inconvenience anymore. It was about respect. My driveway wasn't some public parking lot. It was mine. And yet, Karen acted like it was hers to use whenever she pleased. Every time I saw her car sitting there, I felt a pang of frustration bubbling inside me. Why couldn't she understand how unfair this was? Didn't she realize that constantly ignoring my requests was crossing a line? Still, I held back. I didn't want to cause trouble or make enemies with my new neighbor. But deep down, I knew this couldn't go on forever. Something had to give, and sooner rather than later. At first, I thought maybe Karen just needed a little more time to adjust to the neighborhood. After all, moving into a new place can be overwhelming, and perhaps she was dealing with things I didn't know about. So I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. But as the days went by, it became clear that this wasn't a temporary issue. It was becoming a pattern. Her car kept showing up in my driveway like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. I tried being polite. Really, I did. The next time I saw her SUV parked where it shouldn't be, I left a handwritten note under her windshield wiper. It wasn't mean or confrontational, just simple and straightforward. "Hi Karen, please remember this is private property. Could you avoid parking here in the future? Thanks." The next morning, her car was gone. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Maybe the note had worked. Maybe she finally understood. But my hope didn't last long. By the end of the week, her SUV was back in the exact same spot. This time, I sent her a text message. "Hey Karen, just a reminder that your car is in my driveway again. Please try to park elsewhere moving forward." Her response came quickly. "Oh, sorry. I'll move it later today." But later never came. Hours turned into days, and her car stayed put. Each time I asked her to move it, she gave me the same vague promises. Promises she clearly had no intention of keeping. It was maddening. How could someone act so entitled? Then one evening, after a long day at work, I pulled into my driveway only to find her SUV blocking me in. There was no room for my car. No note explaining why hers was there. Nothing. Just her vehicle, sitting smugly in my space like it owned the place. That's when I snapped. I marched over to her house, my blood boiling despite my best efforts to stay calm. When she opened the door, I could barely contain my frustration. "Karen," I said, my voice tight with anger, "your car is in my way." Again. She looked at me blankly, as if she had no idea what I was talking about. Then, with a shrug, she said, "Just park on the street. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. Not a big deal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did she really think it was okay to dictate how I used my own property? Did she honestly expect me to rearrange my life because she couldn't be bothered to follow basic rules of respect? "It is a big deal," I shot back, my voice rising despite my attempts to stay composed. "This is my driveway. You don't get to decide what I do with it. And telling me to just park on the street isn't helpful. It's disrespectful." For the first time since we'd met, Karen looked uncomfortable. But instead of apologizing or offering a solution, she brushed me off. "Fine," she muttered, rolling her eyes. "I'll move it tomorrow." Tomorrow came and went. And guess what? Her car was still there. That's when I realized something important. Karen wasn't going to change unless I made her. She wasn't going to respect my boundaries unless I enforced them. And while I didn't want to escalate things, I also knew I couldn't keep letting her walk all over me. So I started thinking about my options. What could I do to make her understand that this behavior wasn't acceptable? How could I protect my space without causing unnecessary drama? As I stood there staring at her car, a plan began forming in my mind. One that would either solve the problem once and for all or make things infinitely worse. Either way, I was done playing nice. After weeks of frustration, I decided it was time to take action. Enough was enough. Karen had proven that she wasn't going to respect my requests or boundaries, no matter how politely I asked. So, I did what any reasonable person would do when someone repeatedly parks on their private property without permission. I called a towing company. The next morning, I woke up early, brewed myself a strong cup of coffee, and waited for the tow truck to arrive. It didn't take long before I heard the familiar rumble of its engine pulling into my driveway. The driver hopped out, gave me a quick nod, and got to work hooking Karen's SUV onto the flap. As he worked, I stood nearby, watching with a mix of satisfaction and nervousness. This was uncharted territory for me. I'd never towed someone's car before, and while I knew I was within my rights, I couldn't help but wonder how Karen would react. Sure enough, just as the tow truck began lifting her car off the ground, Karen stormed out of her house. She was wearing pajamas, her hair messy, and her face red with anger. "What are you doing?" she screamed, pointing at the tow truck like it was some kind of alien spaceship invading her yard. I took a deep breath and walked over to her, keeping my tone calm but firm. "I warned you multiple times not to park in my driveway," I said. "You ignored every single one of those warnings. This is private property, and I'm enforcing my rights." Her jaw dropped, and for a moment, she looked speechless. Then, her voice rose to an almost comical level. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to get a car out of impound? Are you serious right now?" "Yes," I replied evenly, crossing my arms. "I'm very serious. And if you'd listened to me earlier, none of this would have happened." Karen glared at me, her eyes narrowing into slits. "You're going to regret this," she hissed. "This isn't over." I shrugged, refusing to let her intimidation tactics work on me. "It is for now," I said simply. "Next time, maybe think twice before parking where you don't belong." With that, the tow truck drove away, leaving Karen standing in my driveway, fuming. She muttered something under her breath, probably another threat. But I didn't stick around to hear it. Instead, I went back inside, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. On one hand, I finally drawn a line in the sand. On the other, I knew Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. Later that day, true to her word, Karen came knocking on my door. I opened it cautiously, bracing myself for whatever storm she was about to unleash. "This was completely unnecessary," she snapped, jabbing a finger at me. "You could have handled this differently." "Could I?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "How exactly?" "You ignored every polite request I made. What else was I supposed to do? Let you keep using my driveway whenever you felt like it?" She sputtered, clearly caught off guard by my directness. "Fine," she spat. "But don't think this is the end of it." "Oh, I don't," I replied coolly. "But just so we're clear, if your car ends up in my driveway again, it's getting towed again. No more warnings." Karen stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned on her heel and stomped back to her house, slamming the door behind her. As I closed my own door, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. For the first time in weeks, my driveway was empty, and mine alone. But I also knew this wasn't truly over. Karen wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat, and I had a sinking feeling she'd find a way to retaliate. Still, I reminded myself that I'd done the right thing. Sometimes, standing your ground means making tough decisions, even if they come with consequences. To my surprise and frustration, Karen didn't learn her lesson after the first tow. If anything, she seemed more determined than ever to push back against me. Instead of respecting my boundaries, she doubled down on her behavior. It was as if towing her car had only fueled her stubbornness, and she made it clear that she wasn't going to let this go. It started subtly at first. She began parking in my driveway late at night, when she knew I wouldn't catch her right away. By the time I noticed her car sitting there the next morning, she'd already left for work, leaving me to deal with the mess she created. Each time, I documented it, snapping photos of her license plate, jotting down the date and time, and saving screenshots of our previous conversations, where I'd explicitly told her not to park there. I knew I might need proof later, especially if things escalated further. But documenting her actions wasn't enough to stop her. Karen continued to test my patience, sneaking her SUV into my driveway whenever it suited her. One evening, I came home from running errands to find her car blocking me yet again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I immediately called the towing company, just like I'd done before. The second tow happened early the next morning. I woke up while it was still dark outside, brewed a pot of coffee, and waited for the tow truck to arrive. As the sun began to rise, I watched from my window as the driver expertly hooked her car onto the flabbed. The entire process felt eerily familiar, but this time, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I knew Karen would throw another fit, but I also knew I was within my rights to protect my property. Sure enough, Karen appeared moments later, looking even angrier than the first time. She stormed out of her house in sweatpants and slippers, yelling at the top of her lungs. "Are you kidding, Emily? Again?" I stepped outside, clutching my mug of coffee, and met her gaze head-on. "You parked in my driveway," I said calmly. "Twice now. What did you think would happen?" "This is ridiculous," she shouted, throwing her hands in the air. "Do you have any idea how inconvenient this is for me? You're being completely unreasonable." "Unreasonable?" I replied, raising an eyebrow. "How am I being unreasonable? You're the one trespassing on private property. All you had to do was respect my space, and none of this would have happened." Karen's face turned bright red, and she looked like she wanted to argue further, but she must have realized she didn't have much of a leg to stand on. Instead, she crossed her arms and glared at me. "You're making a huge mistake," she muttered darkly. "This isn't over." "Oh, I know it's not," I said with a shrug. "But here's the thing. Every time your car ends up in my driveway, it's getting towed. That's not a threat. It's a promise." With that, the tow truck drove off, leaving Karen standing in the middle of the street, fuming. She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes burning with anger, before turning around and marching back inside her house. Later that afternoon, I received a text from her. It was short and curt. "We need to talk." I sighed, knowing this wasn't going to be pleasant. When I walked over to her house, she greeted me with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Look," she began, her tone clipped. "I get that you're upset, but this has gone too far. Towing my car twice is excessive. Can't we just move past this?" "Excessive," I repeated, keeping my voice steady. "Karen, you've been parking in my driveway without permission for months. I gave you plenty of chances to fix this yourself, but you ignored them all. How is towing your car excessive when you refuse to follow basic rules?" She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, clearly struggling to come up with a valid argument. Finally, she sighed and looked away. "Fine," she muttered reluctantly. "I'll stop parking there, but don't expect me to forget about this." "I don't," I replied honestly. "But if you stick to your word, we won't have any problems moving forward." As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and exhaustion. For now, the battle seemed to be over. But I knew Karen well enough to suspect that this wouldn't be the last time we clashed. Still, I reminded myself that standing up for myself was worth it, no matter how difficult or frustrating it got. Karen may have promised to stop parking in my driveway, but that didn't mean she was ready to let things go. If anything, her behavior took a darker turn. She stopped trespassing on my property, at least for the time being. But she found other ways to retaliate. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but over time, her actions became impossible to ignore. It started with noise. Late at night, when I was trying to wind down after a long day, I'd hear loud music blaring from her house. At first, it wasn't too bad, just the faint sound of a bass line or a muffled beat. But soon, the volume cranked up, and the music played well past midnight. It wasn't just annoying, it was deliberate. I could tell because as soon as I closed my windows or turned on a fan to drown out the noise, the volume would spike again, like she was daring me to say something. One particularly rough night, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the non-emergency line for the police department and filed a noise complaint. An officer arrived within the hour, knocking on Karen's door while I stayed inside, pretending not to watch through the curtains. When Karen answered, she looked furious, glaring daggers at me even though I hadn't stepped outside. The officer explained the noise ordinance rules, and while she nodded politely, I could see the resentment simmering behind her tight smile. But the music wasn't the only thing she used to get under my skin. A few days later, I noticed something strange in my yard, a pile of trash bags sitting neatly on my side of the fence. At first, I thought maybe someone had dumped them there by accident, but when I'd opened one of the bags, I recognized the contents: empty soda cans, food wrappers, and old newspapers, all things Karen regularly threw away. I snapped pictures of the trash and sent them to our homeowners association, HOA, along with a brief explanation of what had happened. Within hours, an HOA representative contacted Karen, reminding her about neighborhood cleanliness policies and warning her about improper waste disposal. She denied everything, of course, claiming she had no idea how the trash ended up in my yard, but her excuses rang hollow. Everyone involved knew exactly who was responsible. Her husband seemed increasingly embarrassed by her antics. Whenever we crossed paths, he gave me awkward apologies, muttering things like, "Sorry about all this," or "she's going through a lot right now." I felt bad for him. He clearly didn't sign up for this kind of drama. But I couldn't afford to feel sorry for Karen. Every petty move she made reinforced the fact that she wasn't willing to coexist peacefully unless forced to. Still, her retaliation didn't stop there. One afternoon, I came home to find her standing in the middle of the street, chatting animatedly with another neighbor. As I approached, I caught snippets of their conversation. "Totally unreasonable," Karen was saying, shaking her head dramatically. "She had my car towed twice. Can you believe that?" The neighbor glanced at me, looking uncomfortable, and quickly excused herself. Karen turned to me, her arms crossed and her expression smug. "What?" she demanded, as if daring me to confront her. "Nothing," I replied. Cool people read it. Karen's campaign of retaliation reached its peak one afternoon when I came home to find not one, but two of her cars parked in my driveway. Apparently, she'd invited friends over and decided that my property was the perfect overflow parking lot for their vehicles. It was as if she was deliberately trying to push me to my breaking point, and honestly, it was working. I stood there for a moment, staring at the scene in disbelief. How could someone be so brazen, so entitled? I had already towed her car twice, filed noise complaints, and dealt with her petty attempts to annoy me. Yet here she was, blatantly disregarding everything we'd been through. Enough was enough. This time, I didn't call the towing company right away. Instead, I called the police. When the officer arrived, I explained the situation calmly, showing him the photos I'd taken of her previous violations and handing over copies of our text exchanges where I'd clearly stated my boundaries. He nodded thoughtfully, then walked over to Karen's house to speak with her. Karen emerged from her front door looking flustered, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The officer gestured toward my driveway and began explaining the legal implications of unauthorized use of private property. "Trespassing is a serious matter," he said firmly. "If this happens again, formal charges could be filed." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Karen looked genuinely rattled. Her usual confidence seemed to crumble under the weight of the officer's words. She glanced at me, her eyes wide with a mix of anger and fear, before turning back to the officer. "I didn't mean any harm," she stammered. "I just thought. I didn't realize." "You've been told repeatedly," the officer interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This needs to stop. Do you understand?" She nodded quickly, avoiding eye contact with both of us. "Yes, sir. I understand." As the officer drove away, Karen lingered in her doorway, watching me warily. For once, she didn't have a snarky comment or a defiant glare. Instead, she muttered something under her breath, probably another empty threat, and retreated into her house, slamming the door behind her. That night, I sat on my couch, replaying the day's events in my head. Part of me felt guilty for involving the police. After all, no one wants to escalate a neighborhood dispute to that level. But the other part of me knew it was necessary. Karen had proven time and again that she wouldn't respect my boundaries unless forced to. By bringing in law enforcement, I wasn't just protecting my property. I was sending a clear message. I wasn't going to tolerate her behavior anymore. The next morning, I woke up half expecting to see her car in my driveway yet again. But to my relief, it was empty. In fact, for the first time in months, Karen seemed to be keeping her distance. Her blinds stayed closed, and she avoided making eye contact whenever we passed each other outside. Even her husband seemed relieved, giving me small, grateful nods whenever he saw me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Karen might have backed off, for now, but I doubted she'd let go of her grudge so easily. People like her rarely admit defeat, and I suspected she'd find some other way to make my life difficult. But for the moment, peace had been restored. My driveway was mine again, and I finally felt like I could breathe without constantly looking over my shoulder. Standing up for myself hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Sometimes you have to draw a line in the sand, even if it means facing resistance. And as exhausting as this entire experience had been, I knew one thing for certain. I'd never let anyone trample over my rights again. Weeks passed, and Karen's behavior slowly began to change, or rather, fade into the background. She stopped parking in my driveway, blasting loud music late at night, or leaving trash on my side of the fence. At first, I was skeptical. Had she really given up her campaign of retaliation, or was this just another temporary lull? But as the days turned into months, it became clear that something had shifted. Karen kept to herself more, rarely venturing outside except for the occasional trip to her car. When we did cross paths, she'd offer a curt nod or mumble a quick hello before hurrying away. It wasn't exactly neighborly, but it was peaceful, and that was all I cared about. Her husband, however, seemed to soften toward me. One evening, as I was watering my plants, he approached me with an awkward smile. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say, thanks for not making things worse." "Worse?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You know, with everything that happened," he admitted, glancing toward their house. "Karen can be difficult sometimes, and I think she finally realized she went too far." I didn't respond right away. Part of me felt sorry for him. He'd been caught in the middle of his wife's antics, but I also knew that Karen's actions were entirely her own choice. Still, I appreciated his honesty. "I'm glad things are calming down," I said finally. All I ever wanted was for everyone to respect each other's space. He nodded, looking relieved. "Yeah, well, hopefully we can start fresh from here." A few months later, Karen put her house on the market. It didn't come as a complete surprise. She'd always seemed like someone who thrived on drama, and without a conflict to fuel her energy, she probably found the neighborhood unbearably boring. When the sold sign went up in her yard, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and even a twinge of sadness. Despite everything, I hoped she'd learn from this experience and approach her next community with a little more humility. The new neighbors couldn't have been more different. A young family moved in, a couple with 2 kids under the age of 10. They introduced themselves the day they arrived, bringing over a plate of homemade cookies as a thank you for welcoming them. Their kids laughed and played in the front yard, filling the street with life and laughter. For the first time since moving in, I felt like Brookside Lane truly felt like home. Still, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Dealing with Karen had tested my patience, my resolve, and even my faith in humanity at times. But it had also taught me something important. Standing up for yourself isn't about being confrontational or aggressive. It's about setting boundaries and sticking to them, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. Sometimes, doing the right thing means facing resistance, but in the end, it's always worth it. One crisp autumn morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I noticed one of the kids from the new family riding their bike past my driveway. They waved enthusiastically, and I waved back, smiling. My driveway sat empty and untouched, exactly as it should be. Looking back, I realized that the battle with Karen wasn't just about parking spaces or noise complaints. It was about asserting my place in the world, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. It reminded me that while kindness and patience are important, so is self-respect. You can't control how others behave, but you can decide how much you're willing to tolerate. And as I watched the golden leaves drift lazily to the ground, I knew one thing for certain: my driveway and my peace of mind was finally mine to enjoy.